afternoon, everyone. My name is Atiyyah Khan. I am an arts journalist and researcher and DJ based in Cape Town, but I'm from Joburg originally. I'm from Benoni. And we'll just do, I think we had for those of you who were downstairs, I think we had a very interesting, brief kind of introduction to today's discussion. But just to introduce you again, we have to my left Lesego Rampolokeng, who's a poet, and for me needs no introduction, but we will go deeper into these histories in a bit. And then Kamyar Bineshtarigh, who is an artist from Iran, but based in Cape Town. And Kamyar and I met last year when I did a story about his previous works, so we've connected already through kind of this idea of language and text previously. And Daiyaan, who is our very young scholar researcher, very happy to have him. And I think that we've had several discussions about this particular discussion. And so it's like panel discussions upon panel discussions before the actual panel discussion. And the main thing is that for those of you who were able to see the work, or for those of you who just arrived, we're going to be going through some of the points mentioned downstairs a little bit again. The basic idea is to talk about this interest in Arabic-Afrikaans through the title of Koples, which is the title of Kamyar's exhibition, and also how our different interests kind of converge into this. So we find different meeting points, although we are by no means a panel of experts, and we are also just learning as we go along. And a lot of this history is still a contested history that's still being researched. So it's a process of unfolding, over time. I myself, as somebody who's not from Cape Town, had to, learn a lot about this by just asking various people, by visiting people's homes. But yeah, I think a good entry point into this discussion is to start with Daiyaan, who some of you spoke to downstairs, and why he knows so much about this topic. Because this is not Daiyaan's job, nor is it his form of study. He is a mere 22 years old, and yet is a wealth of knowledge, and is uncovering so much about South Africa's or Cape Town's history that is actually super essential. So, Daiyaan, could you explain to the people in the room who kept picking your brain, why is it that you're so interested in this?
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name's Abdud-Daiyaan Petersen, but people just call me Daiyaan. So I'm actually an environmental science and Arabic student at UCT in my third year. So this is not my formal studies, but I had the privilege of being raised by my great-grandparents who grew up in Vryburg and De Waterkant near the boek in Cape Town, respectively. And growing up, I had the privilege of listening to their stories, stories about die plaas en die boer in die Vryburg, and about, the Hatta, the great-grandmother in Loude Street in De Waterkant, and, a lot of old Malay stories. And I grew up with a lot of these Malay words as well, Labarang, Tramakasi, the words are countless. And in addition to that, I also grew up with this culture of Koples, where I was taught in a very traditional manner, how to read how to read Arabic through a specific method, which, one of the exhibitions inside, unfortunately the sound wasn't working, but it's a method of combining Arabic taught in a Malay language. So we would say alif tetas a, alif tapan I, alif bawa u, a, I, u. In that manner to learn, the vowels and the letters and so on. And growing up in that way, I didn't think it was special or anything like that. I just thought, okay, this is me, this is my family, this is my community. This is how we grow up. This is life, And only once I got older, I went to university or I went to high school, and I realized, actually, our community is so distinct. And it's so unique, compared to other communities around the world. We are actually a minority community. We are this mix of, Indonesian and Dutch and British and Arab and, local, Khoi influence as well. And that prompted me to look into my family's origins. I myself and also mixed, part of my family are from India. My grandfather's from a village in India. My other grandfather was a white person that became Muslim. And I started going to the archives to discover, who am I? Where did my grandparents come from? I found immigration records in the archives with photographs of my great-great-grandparents. And this sparked my interest into who I am, as well as, the community that I come from, and more so the minority community that I find myself in. And I also realized that there is so little documentation and research done on this community, which prompted me to conduct my own research into this community.
I mean, many people might not be familiar with, we were debating this earlier, how many South Africans know about our history of slavery? How many South Africans, was it taught to us? Definitely wasn't taught to me in school. And so, just to provide some context for those who might not know, but for me, my interest in this is how realizing that the Dutch East India Company actually had a very big role in the spreading of Islam in the Cape, because they brought so many, they brought political prisoners, imams, royal exiles, and slaves with them. And at the time, Dayan mentioned that Islam was banned for a while in the Cape, but basically one of the scholars who came was a scribe and a prince, I guess, Tuan Guru, right? So he was called Tuan Guru, that was not his name, but he is known for a few accolades that helped spread the education of Islam in the Cape. And one of them was, he was imprisoned on Robben Island, and he wrote the Quran from memory from the island. And another one that's kind of where we link back to this conversation, and it's kind of important before introducing where Kamyar comes in, is that Tuan Guru was responsible for starting the first madrasa in the Cape, or school of learning, and also which became the first mosque. It's called the Owel Mosque, Owel meaning first. It's in the Burkab. And in the madrasa, Arabic-Afrikaans was taught using Arabic as a medium of instruction. So this kind of dates back to roughly, let's say, the 1850s. The mosque came about in the 1700s, right? Late 1700s. So in the 1850s, let's say that there's early documentation of students who were slaves. They were also Freya Zwarten, who were like the free blacks. And it wasn't necessarily about religion. It wasn't that they had to be Muslim, but they were taught, or they were educated as a way of like learning, because there wasn't any other learning available to them through these madrasas, but the text was written in Arabic. So it's Afrikaans language, but that's written using Arabic letters, if that has not been understood yet. So we're talking a lot about transliteration in various ways through this conversation. But Kamyar, I would love to know, for somebody who has, come to South Africa from Iran, has been working with text in ways that are not precious in the calligraphic sense, but are still using words as a medium, sometimes as like signs on the wall or just marks that can also be looked at. What was your interest into this?
So my interest with language, I think written form of language especially, comes from my background with calligraphy, because like my dad was a calligrapher and my uncle as well. So I grew up around them, like being inspired by calligraphy. I did also study a bit of calligraphy at school. Our arts classes in primary school in Iran was like two parts. We had like fine art, and then you had calligraphy, which is a very important form of art in the Islamic countries, because like the writing itself is very important. And also it's partly because in a lot of Muslim countries, the idea of like representational art making, as in like you couldn't really paint a figure. So that's why like ideas of pattern making and calligraphy became a very big form of art making in those countries. And then but I wasn't really interested in calligraphy. I mean, I'm inspired by calligraphy, but I never wanted to become a calligrapher from a certain point. Because I think fine art for me became more like a broader perspective that I could do so much. If I was going to limit myself to calligraphy, it would have been not as expandable place for me to play. So I became interested in language side of calligraphy, writing, forms. So what it means to actually write and what it means for us to recognize a written form as a comprehensive thing. And I was like trying to dig into like the idea of like what if we just see them as marks and not necessarily meanings. And but also the idea of like transliteration, as you mentioned, was very interesting for me because like, you know, like the aesthetic of the written forms are very different. And one of the ideas that you see someone as foreign is language itself. So the written form you see immediately if you see like Arabic letters or any other form of writings that is not Roman in a Eurocentric world would immediately become this foreign, this like, you know, don't belong to, or like this is like strange writings, or very like you can't really understand how this writing is a form of writing that can be read, which is very similar actually. Like phonetically writing, Arabic is very similar to Roman character because like you turn a sound into a letter. And so I started playing around that, like in previous works, which Atiyyah also mentioned. I started like writing English, but using Arabic letters. So that was very interesting for me because like the language remains English, which is supposed to be seen as this Roman character aesthetic, but then the aesthetic of it becomes completely foreign. And then the text I decided to use was Edward Said's Orientalism, which is talking about the view towards the East, how that is perceived, how it's seen. And the visual of it immediately was giving that, but the text was actually initially written in English. So I think with Arabic-Afrikaans that was a very big influence for me to realize this language that I was meant to believe that was like a very Dutch language was actually first written in Arabic letters. So I like did my research, like how and why this happened, and then I started finding the documents and using them as the source material for this exhibition. So I think that's where my inspiration for like language and this exhibition came about. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe perhaps linking back to a different experience is that for me, Afrikaans was just something we had to learn in school and was not something I had any passion for until I moved to Cape Town and heard it spoken in Cape Town in a different way with a kind of rhythm, and then started learning all these words that people use that don't exist here. And then also with regards to Arabic, then similarly to you, in our madrasas, because we have to learn how to read the Quran, we have to learn how to write and recite Arabic, because the benefit of the Quran is in the recitation, not necessarily in knowing the meaning. So Kamyar and I can both read Arabic, but we don't understand it. Right?
Yeah.
He speaks and understands Farsi. I can read these texts, but I don't necessarily know what's happening. And that's always been kind of like the weird gap, I think, in our approaches to language. So for me, now that I can read these texts or these kitabs or these books that are downstairs and know that it's in Afrikaans, there's a chance that I may actually understand them. Okay, Lesego. So coming in from your perspective, growing up in Orlando West in the 70s, let's just go back to what was your experience with Afrikaans growing up? Was it much around in your family? You know, before you started writing? That's all.
Okay. Hi. First of all, let me start out by saying I see myself living in the world of symbols, of signs, of which written words are some, but not the only ones. Okay. There's hieroglyphics. Nobody speaks painting, but it is a language. You can read in and out of a painting, of a photograph, of a silent film, etc. Anyway, back to the Soweto thing. You know, when you hear anybody who grew up in Soweto bragging about how they speak multiple languages, it's laughable. It's a joke. Because, first of all, people were plonked in Soweto. Shangaan people, Zulu people, Sotho people, etc., even with the apartheid regime's attempt at further putting markers and lines of demarcation per tribe, let's call it that. That I grew up with a Shangaan boy, a Venda kid, a Zulu, and I got a working facility with all those languages. So when a friend of mine stands on stage with his guitar in Europe and brags to his audience, oh, I speak 9 languages, I can only laugh because he'd have to be a total cretin not to be able to do so. Okay, another thing is this misconception of Afrikaans as the oppressor's language. Now, my mother and my father go as Botswana. Well, let me not say they go as. That's what the population register set them down as. These are Tswanas. Okay, fine. When they communicate in the house, he'll be saying to you, you understand what I'm saying? It is, should I say, I wouldn't say tributary. It's a fallout from the Afrikaans language, but it's spoken differently to how a Kapi would speak it. But the basis is the same. Even during 1976 and the riots, etc., you had writers like Chris van Wyk, like Faisal Yohanese, Sipho Sipamla, Dikobe Mohale, or Billy Balanski's legacy. Okay, Chris van Wyk, Brabiza Denka Coding Change. And these are writers of social conscience, working with that language, using it as a tool. We have to remember, every language can be a weapon and it can be a tool. Can be used to oppress. It can also be used in a liberatory manner. Even symbols, the swastika, the Hakenkreuz, had a spiritual basis in its beginnings, which got taken over and subsequently turned into a symbol of evil. That is why language is so dangerous and so deadly. For me, it's the deadliest weapon anywhere on earth. Because the first thing, of course, any oppressor does is to rob you of your language, thereby attempting to rob you of memory. How you work with ink, and then bleach it out, glue, I mean, the each one teach one, whatever we used to run around chanting that slogan, each one teach one, glue, pull together, make grow, scratch that. Each one bleach one, right. Eradicate that. Right. So that's my take on the African South. In brief, we can go deeper into this at some point.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for bringing up that point, because I wanted to also head into this idea of erasure, eradication, and I think that's one of the reasons Kamyar has said that you chose to focus on these particular books, because of the idea of erasure. But perhaps you could speak to people to tell us a little bit more about the method, like why specifically the ink. I mean, ink is a medium that has been used to write for centuries. Then the glue, and then the whitewashing through the bleach?
Yes, yeah, I think the materiality for me is the language itself. So I think like for me, when I'm in the studio and working with the material, for me it's like the time that I'm having the time of my, like, you know, it's like the most interesting for me because I'm having a conversation with the material itself. That itself is a language, as you mentioned. So I think, yeah, ink is a very old inscription method. So most of the documents that we have that has survived is written with ink. So using ink perhaps is kind of talking about that. And then bleaching the work, it's the erasure is with the bleach that happens. If you saw the work, you could see like the parts that are like very faded out. But also realizing that even when I bleached it, still it doesn't disappear. It's always like you can see remnants, that you can see there is still, you can still see it. So I think for me that the idea of using ink and bleach was as a material was very important because it has a history in itself. And the conversation that they have with each other is also a language. Yeah, it's quite a violent act as well to try to bleach it out, you know, to try to erase it in terms of materiality. But coming back to...
Yeah, I mean, just on this point of erasure, within living in Cape Town, these are not necessarily, unless you're in these communities, unless you come from perhaps a Malay background or you're doing research, you might not come across this at all in your experience of Cape Town. I don't think there are any museums with Koples book or kitabs on maybe Simonstown, but on show. There's also a cemetery. Daiyaan and I had a very interesting conversation about cemeteries because his research into this work is through graveyards and cemeteries. And if you go to the Tanah Baru cemetery, which is up in Bo-Kaap, you have gravestones that have inscriptions of Javi that are written in Arabic, that are written in like, they can be studied as materials just in themselves, you know. So yet for many years, the Tanah Baru cemetery was used for like vagrants to just hang out in. It was definitely not something to be looked after. It was just a place that was kind of forgotten about, and yet it's kind of another part of South Africa's history. So when we talk about erasure, whitewashing, all of this, we're just talking about just highlighting other aspects that are equally as important, and don't ever get into mainstream narratives necessarily. So Daiyaan, just in terms of the process of finding these kitabs, I know you spoke a little bit about it downstairs, but could you talk a little bit more about that?
The process of finding the kitabs has a lot to do with networking. So in order to find the kitabs, most of the time you'd have to come from the community and, you know, check, do I have any kitabs in my house? You know, ask my grandparents or my parents, you know, are there any books stowed away in the cupboard, in the ceiling, in the attic or something? That, you know, that has never been taken out simply because we don't understand it or because we attach some sort of emotion to it that we don't feel it proper to take out at any time to view. So that would be the first place that you would look to find these kitabs. Then you go and you ask extended family and you contact them and then you tell them, oh, I am interested in, you know, my Puya or Papa or so on, did he have any books or kitabs that he left behind? And so you start building your database, your networks. You speak to academics who have gone through a similar process in finding these kitabs, and you look for ones that have been publicized, put on display, such as in Simonstown, which has the largest display of Arabic. In fact, it might be the largest collection of these, not only Arabic-Afrikaans, but also Javanese and Sumbawanese kitabs or books as well. And you go to the museums, the cultural museum opposite the slave lodge, they've got as well. So that would be the process in trying to find these kitabs, is working through these networks, community networks and academic networks in finding them. But you mentioned the cemeteries. If you don't have access to the kitabs, you can go to any of the old Malay cemeteries because there's bound to be a tombstone there that's either written in Malay using Arabic script or in Mowbray in Cape Town. I found a number of tombstones written in a very colloquialized form of, you know, Kaapse Hollands or Dutch, or Cape Dutch rather, or you know, what we call today Afrikaans. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, even through my research, I found that I wrote a story about a calligrapher who was trying to study Tuan Guru's script in order to teach it. So he was trying to learn the way that he wrote in order to like now pass on this ancient way of calligraphy. And he said that he was finding a lot of trouble trying to get access to these books or kitabs because a lot of families, they're kind of like family heirlooms. So they stored away in garages or attics, and hence also the old, you know, the feeling of the artwork feeling like dated, you know, like the whitewash, the bleach and the glue gives it a sense of time, right? So a lot of these things, but the families don't really want to let go of them. Perhaps they die out as the generations die out, but also a lot of them can't read them. So that's where kind of like new scholars or just people who are interested are so important because, as mentioned, they're not just books that talk about how to learn about Islam. They are also letters that were written. They could be very essential parts of history that you can find out. So I think one of the stories that came out was that this idea that Tuan Guru was taken straight to Robben Island, but actually there's a story from one of the letters that he was actually in Cape Town before he went. So this is where the letters come in. So I just think that like we're just at the start of changing this history. Not to say that, again, Afrikaans is the oppressor's language, because clearly it's not. Despite what you've been told or what we've learned. And I think, Lesego, coming back to you, we spoke also about your time. Maybe you can tell us a bit more, because I myself am interested in the full frame movement and what that was like. Were you connected with them? What was that time period like?
Okay. A point, just so I don't forget, yeah. It's interesting to me, you've spoken about Islam, Arabic, Afrikaans, Calvinism. But I'll log on to that at some point, okay. If time allows. You can log into it now, it's fine. No, it's cool. You see, what's called the full frame movement was a group of young, shall we say, alternative Afrikaners, one whose father was Chief Justice, another whose ancestor somewhere was the guy who actually fashioned what later became apartheid. One whose dad was a dominee, another one whose dad was in parliament somewhere, another, so these were kids who were really raised within the enclaves of the apartheid machinery, who then broke out. I don't know how true this is, but it is said that when white kids grow up and get rebellious, they rebel against their parents. Black ones, I don't know what they rebel against, something else. But that's beside the point. What I'm trying to say is, these people came together. I mean, not like it was an organization or whatever. You had Ralph Rabie, whose dad was Chief Justice Rabie, and then you had Koos Kombe's, Andre Letoy, who was a writer before he became this musician. You had the one guy who actually kick-started it, who was only half Afrikaans and half English, James Phillips, who dropped his first single. It was Hou My Vas Corpora. Hou My Vas Corpora. Sal ek weer my cherry sien as ek van die trein afklim, ja so waar Corpora. Ek is naar Corpora, which was actually a kick out against these kids being dragged out of their homes and sent to die on South Africa's borders in defense of an evil system, right? They did that. He called himself Bernardo Niemand. Now, Ralph Rabie calls himself Johannes Kerkorrel, and so they came together and wrote and performed and traveled all across the country, trying to raise awareness and consciousness among students mainly of their race. They performed in mainly Afrikaans universities, and they got banned from some of them. In certain places, the Tannies of the town came out that these were Satanists, etc., etc., etc. And I recorded Shifty Records, which was the recording home of a whole lot of these people. And they used the Afrikaans language in the service of what was, in their eyes, a just cause, a fight against the apartheid system. Now, maybe I need not mention that even within that, when we went to these places, the police and the adults who were, for the machinery, the worst they would do would be to cut the car tires of these musicians. And in some places there was something called purple rain, squirted them with purple color. Anyway, all of that. But you would be assured that they would not get arrested. They would not get terribly beaten up. But I, within their midst, had to watch my eyes. So I don't know what that says to you, but that was the world of the alternative Afrikaans movement. And I love those people. They've got some serious classics. Hilbro by Johannes Kerkorrel is one of the best, for me, songs ever written and recorded in South Africa. There's a few such pieces of music, which I've got, by the way, and I can gladly DJ to whoever wants to come visit.
I think that, this is also something that growing up, it's something I only heard about. I wasn't actually there, and we can only listen to the music and use that to try and understand and put ourselves in that time period. That is also one of the things we trying to put ourselves back into history. I think that's what we all actually trying to do in some ways. So before we open it up to questions, is there anything you guys did I miss? No. Lesego, actually, I did want to ask you about your connection, because, again, is it something that was spoken in the home? Your connection to Afrikaans with regards to your writing and your poetry. Is it something that consciously or unconsciously comes through, or because, again, it's not an approach where you just anti-Afrikaans, like a lot of people who I have met, who I grew up with around Joburg, just refuse,
I'm not anti-Africa. I'm not anti any language. Language per se has never in itself killed anybody. It is how it is utilized that is of consequence. How, for example, there wouldn't have been the Holocaust, the German Holocaust, were it not for the usage of language in a specific way. When we talk about brainwashing, when we talk about writing, unwriting, rewriting of history, when we talk about all levels actually of human communication, human engagement, at the heart of it is this thing that we call love. Now, Afrikaans, for me, is not problematic in the way, for example, what do they call it? Fanagalo is. That is very problematic because Fanagalo was a slave and master language meant only to communicate the giving and the taking of orders. That's why it's going to be taken, it's tatalapa begalapa, meaning take here, put here, take here, put here. You cannot at all express love in Fanagalo, for example. That is, for me, what is problematic about it. Not the Afrikaans language. Yes, indeed, it was moved and privileged at the expense of all other languages, etc., and centralized and made to wear the face of white supremacist officialdom. That was the problem with it. If we're going to say, for example, the Soweto uprising, which of course didn't only start and end in Soweto. You know, Michel's Plain, Langa, everywhere, all over the country, right? I call Soweto because, okay, that was their found. Sure. If we're going to say it was because Afrikaans was the language of the oppressor, in my opinion, English is an even bigger language of the oppressor. You know, so I believe, let me just put this question out there. If we had said, if anybody had said, Sepedi is going to be the medium of instruction across South Africa, would people have been happy? And I think that's a valid question. So the issues at the heart of those uprisings were much more multifaceted than just the usage of this language. It is what it had been made to represent.
Sure.
Anyway, just onto your erasure thing, you know, I'm reminded, for example, of the practice of someone like Jean-Michel Basquiat.
Right.
Okay? Who grew from graffiti, you know, onto canvas, etc., this issue of erasure. And he would do his drawings, his paintings, write his poetry there, with just one line, and then erase some of them, intentionally. So that just reminded me, your usage of bleach, etc. And when one looks at, for example, the Koi case, the painting.
Right. Yeah, cave painting.
Oh, yeah. On the cave. And you realize this thing about how time has been at work, the texture of the painting, where you realize that time on those caves has actually been an artist.
Sure.
Because it has eroded, it has actually inserted certain things within there until there's a whole new painting.
Right. Cool. Okay. So, anybody out there with a question?
I just want to speak a bit to the use of, or the mention of Afrikaans as a language of oppression. I think we should also separate Afrikaans into its dialects, where you had the dialect of Afrikaans, which became today's standaard Afrikaans, which was used by a specific community, right? And then you had other dialects in different parts of the country, such as in the Cape dialect of Afrikaans, which the Cape dialect is a very intersectional dialect, not intersectional in the sense of, you know, the contemporary meaning, but intersectional in that it's the intersection of all these different cultures, all these different communities that came to the Cape. And this new language was formed where the one community where standaard Afrikaans came from, they still try to preserve the old Dutch dialect of you know, the old Dutch. In fact, which is why most of the books we have, the earliest books we have of Afrikaans, is written in Arabic script, because the other communities that were speaking it, or some of them, they still held the value of old Dutch. And they continue to write in their journals and print their Bibles and so on, and give their preaching and speeches in Dutch. Whereas in Cape Town, in some of the churches, in the mosques and so on, they spoke with this Cape dialect, which was the dialect of the slaves, of the Khoi people, of, you know, exiles and so on. And looking at what we're going to eat later, we're going to eat breedi, right? Tamati breedi, as they've mentioned. That itself, I mean, we're told it's a Malay dish, right? Because it's popular amongst the Malay community. But it's not really a Malay dish. It's more a South African dish, because the word breedi itself, from research that I've done, of course it can be contested. The word breedi comes from a Madagascan word or a Mozambican word, which was brought to the Cape, which was actually adopted into Portuguese and then brought to the Cape. And if I'm not mistaken, the word breedi, I'm not sure the original pronunciation, it referred to these green leafy vegetables similar to spinach that they would cook stews with. And there are other words as well, like gumalichis, which you associate, I'm sure many of you know gumalichis, you know, Tweede Nuwe Jaar and so on. That also comes from the what they would call the Maspika, or Mozambican community of slaves, which wasn't necessarily Mozambique itself, but that region of East Africa. When those slaves came, and I'm sure this word that I'm about to say might be familiar to others, they had a drum called the ngoma. and that they would play this music with a ngoma, and over time it became known as the guma. And it became part of Cape culture and later other parts of South African culture into, guma liedjies and so on. And this is why I don't believe it can be called the language of the oppressor, because we took the language of the oppressor, which was Dutch, and we created our own language out of it based on our previous languages that we spoke and the dialects and so on. Yeah.
Sure. You wanted to...
Oh, yeah, let me not monopolize this thing.
No, monopolize away. Monopolize away. Go for it.
If we agree that language doesn't only serve the purpose of communication, that it's also a vehicle for the transmission of people's cultures, handing down of history, etc. That language has packed into it more than just the actual words strung together. That we can then begin to understand how a certain language could be viewed in a different way to yet another language. Now, okay, talking about Africa, these progressive structures, sometimes, you get problems. I wrote a review of a book by a comrade of mine called Atiyyah, right? He's pretty much my age, and he writes poetry like Bloma Mata, Long, Ekeso Texan Terry's Bene in the Dome, da 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 da. Nice. Sounds sweet. Not many people understand it, but it sounds cute. Okay? And I said in this thing, it's fine, this. But nobody of Ike's generation actually speaks that language. That my father and my mother do speak it, but I don't. Because people crawled out of Sophiatown, places like Sophiatown, for instance, to Soweto, and it being language and dynamic and not static, it kept on evolving and changing and taking on other things until what I refer to as Stamto might have some of that in it, but it is not it. So that's just something I just wanted to clarify there. That when Don Matera speaks, and I speak, I can understand what he's saying, but I'm not going to respond to him that way at all, because it is not my dial now.
Yeah, I mean, I think, thank you all for, I think it's really cool that we end up having a very fruitful conversation about language. When Kamyar was talking earlier to us, he mentioned that when he was making the artwork, he took little sections from the books. So he'd go through some of the books and take little sections. So it wasn't necessarily about the meaning of that particular paragraph. Perhaps you couldn't even read it yourself, besides just the Arabic, right? Or even understand it. But that's the starting process of a conversation that ends up in so many different of our experiences of like coming to terms with what is this language connection, and how does it impact our lives separately and together, and also to a greater community who each and every one of you here have a different relationship or approach to Afrikaans and a closeness or distance to it. So I'd love to open up the panel, the questions now, because we've got a DJ set happening and some food awaiting us. I don't know if you need a mic. Is there a mic going around, or you can just, yeah, you can grab one of them. Yeah, you can grab mine.
Hi, I'm Andre. Het sal lekker wees as die panel ook so 'n bietjie Afrikaans kan praat, jy weet. En nie daai standaard taal, 'n bietjie van die Kaapse taal, jy weet. Miskien vir jou, Dayan. How does the panel feel about probably the privatization of Afrikaans now, in terms of KykNet, in terms of Afrikaans language schools that seems to be taking place? And I suppose that's more for you, Atiyyah, and you, Lesego. Because it seems like, oh, the mask. It seems to some extent that Afrikaans has been privatized, and the promotion of Afrikaans, not just the language, but the literature, the festivals, have been privatized in a certain sense by big corporates like Naspers. And then the question for you, Daiyaan, I mean, I grew up in the Cape Flats where English language was seen as higher grade and Afrikaans was seen as lesser. And there was an interesting paper by Kay McCormick on the dialects of District 6, speaking about the Afrikaans being for the lower people and kind of English being the formal language. Is that still the case on the Cape Flats with the youth?
Look, I don't live on the Cape Flats itself, so I can't speak for the Cape Flats, but I can speak for the areas that I live in and some of the areas that I frequent. It's a very difficult question to answer, you know, because there are different perspectives to look at it from. You can look at it at the perspective of apartheid enforcing the standaard Afrikaans, right, and putting the standard on a pedestal, and our dialect as being less than, right? And so we already feel that way towards our dialects of Afrikaans, right? That's the first thing. Secondly, when the British administration came in during the Victorian period, there was this push for English, you know, the Anglicization of South Africa, the Anglicization of the Cape, and then English was put on a pedestal. So you have these two dialects and languages put on the pedestal at different time periods, which leaves our dialect somewhere floating at the bottom. And that's why English is preferred in many spheres. And also, you know, if you look at the Soweto uprising, right, a lot of the activist parts, the activist people in the community, some of them at least, and people who lived in that time, they didn't want to speak Afrikaans because of the connotations that it had in apartheid. And so there is this preference for English. And then there's also the academic, you know, influence where in South Africa today, English is the language of academia, you know, it's apart from Stellenbosch University, but most other universities, English is the language of academia. Lectures are given in English and so on, and which is why English is placed on this pedestal. And then standaard Afrikaans, where in many communities, it's, you know, if I say, "Hoekom maak jy so?" then they say, "No, you must say, "Hoekom maak jy so?" Things like that. Can you understand what I'm trying to say? And then we have our dialect somewhere at the bottom, which is, you know, we keep that for huistaal and straattaal and so on. Yeah.
Actually, Andre, this is not the question you directed to us, this is the second question. But one thing I forgot to mention was that there have been, I mean, this panel is one such discussion around this topic, but through the history of time, there have been people who have tried to like bring up the subject over and over again. One, in my personal experience, when I was still working at independent newspapers, which is at the Cape Argus, which is sister paper to the Star, there was a production called Afrikaans, a theater production that had some like really interesting young kids at the time. Kyle Shepard was a pianist, he must have been about 21, 22. Jitsvinger is a rapper who was rapping in Afrikaans. And Dylan Valley is a filmmaker. So there were all these young creatives who got together to put together this theater performance. And then the theater performance was all about everything we've kind of spoken about, which is tracing Afrikaans roots to, like in Cape Town, what is the connection to Arabic? What is Afrikaans? Some people now call it Kaaps, you know, so that to distinguish that there's Cape Town, the language that's spoken in Cape Town is now Kaaps. So, for instance, there was a film called Barakat that just came out, and the whole thing about Barakat, another story that I did recently. Go out and read the work, people. I'm joking. Barakat is supposed to be the first film, feature film that was shot purely in Afrikaans or Kaaps. So anyways, Afrikaans then evolved into a soundtrack because Jitsvinger and Kyle Shepard did the soundtrack, and later now becomes a documentary about that theater production, which you can find and is still being screened in schools, universities. So But before that, as Dayan reminded me the other day, there was a scholar and a writer in Cape Town called Ahmad Davids who wrote extensive literature about this. Now, it's very hard. I haven't really been able to find his books, but you can find them, where he's kind of delving into this research. So when we think about why these narratives marginalize, it's more because it's not easily accessible to find a lot of this documentation. So this exists as one form of documentation. In terms of the privatization, I'm going to hand you over to our OG over here.
It's quite interesting to me that even for this session, it needed to be mentioned that we're going intergenerational, just to show that, there's a geriatric among us. But that's okay, I can live with it. I once lost a job. The only time I ever went for a job interview in my life, I was asked if I was bilingual. I said, yes, multi, in fact. I said, okay, do you speak English and Afrikaans? And, I made the mistake of not calling it something else. I said, no, I speak some decent English and Tsotsi Da. I didn't get the job. But I think even if I had called it something else, I still would not have got that job. The problem, though, with this Afrikaans as rendered, Sophia Town, etc., and it being misnamed Tsotsi Da, introduced a certain aspect of class into it, like if you speak that language, when actually people like Dr. Gigi Mbeke spoke that language, Khositsile spoke that language, people across all educational spheres and classes and other spoke, but what set it apart was, if there's a clever, you will be able to speak that. But if you've just crawled out of a mud hut or whatever, of course you won't, No, if we're going to talk about class, I guess we could look at it from that angle. But anyway, to this issue of privatization, Africans, standard, as you say, Africans always been privileged, even prior to the inception. Anyway, let's not take it back that far. For example, there was a body called, nicely enough, FAK for short. It was about Afrikaans, Kunst or whatever. It was about the preservation of the Afrikaans language and the cultural aspects that are buried therein, etc., and millions were put into that body and several other bodies like that. There was this Kakaka festival, etc., that, etc. So, when it comes to the privilege accorded Africans, I don't think anybody could question that, right? But if we're saying it has been privatized, become the language of the corporates, is that how you put it? I would say that English is the world beater when it comes to corporatization. That sounds so learned. But what I'm trying to say, you've got people I respect, like Breitenbach, for example, now lobbying for the preservation of Afrikaans because to their eyes, Afrikaans is under siege, it is facing extinction. How do we look at it? This I'd rather throw out.
Hi there. Good day. I just want to say my name is David. I was born in the Northern Cape. Right. I am colored just by name change. So the rest of the family is Tswana. So that's a different dialect of Afrikaans. So I moved to Cape Town when I was at the age of understanding, starting primary school, early days. Then I got there, then what I spoke was not Afrikaans that they spoke. They'd ask me, what are you saying? What is it? Hoe praat jy dit so? I said, Plaas Jappie. So for the fear of not being called a Plaas Jappie, you had to learn and speak the Cape Malay way of speaking. That's why I still sound like that today. And it's coming back to the Afrikaans language under siege. And then, of course, you know, the English that's taken preference. We know in each grade you had one class, and it was always a 10A class, a 10B, not the 10B, the 7A. The A class always the English class, and there was only one class. And if you're in that class, then it means either you got straight there, or you're fair, or you a special class because you speak English, and all our Afrikaans. And I found a problem with it because I was like, it must be from this writing in Arabic, but actually Afrikaans, that a lot of them spoke English, but the way they construct the sentence would actually be Afrikaans. But they just put the English words in, but the whole layout wouldn't make sense like in English, but it'd be, and the point I'm trying to get to is that growing up in the Western Cape, Afrikaans was spoken everywhere. You could get by with Afrikaans. And looking at this generation, being about 40 now, everybody's kid speaks English. Some of them actually speak only Afrikaans in the street, but at home. And the mother and the father would still speak in Afrikaans, but the kids, because they must do better than the parents, so they mustn't speak that Cape Town thing. And I do find that the Cape Townians, somehow my last point had a sense of, I don't know where it came from, because I've also heard that there was rating amongst the colored C1, C2, and C3, and that the Cape Colours was the highest rated colored C1. So I don't know where that comes in, but for them to speak any other dialect, like the Transvaal Afrikaans or whatever, would be a joke really, because you know it'd be a plaas jappy joke, but you're gonna have to like get to speak to them, and that is just the way that it is. So, but now coming back to the point that is the Cape Malay Afrikaans really, I do believe is under siege. Like it's busy dying down. Maybe not the accent and even the way that they speak English, but just the use of the Afrikaans, even though the English got Afrikaans words in it. But it's fading, I feel. Yeah.
I just want to speak about Cape Malay Afrikaans. Maybe I misspoke earlier, but I don't think there's really a thing such as Cape Malay Afrikaans. There's Kaaps, you know, the Afrikaans spoken in Cape Town, and there is a community called if you want to call them Cape Muslims, Cape Malay has become very controversial these days. There's a community with Indonesian or Southeast Asian roots who have inherited a lot of these words from there. But I understand what you're talking about, it being under siege, where we are losing a lot of these words, not only from an Afrikaans perspective, but even those that can speak Afrikaans, they're replacing Tramakasi with Shukran, meaning thank you, or they're replacing Sumbaing, which is our prayer, with Salah, which is an Arabic word. And you can see from different directions, it's under siege, you know, from if you want to call it Puritan perspective, where Arabic is preferred over our previous words for these things, or English is preferred over Afrikaans, or Afrikaans is preferred over the Malay words, and so on. And, you know, at the end of the day, you know, cultures are dynamic, languages are dynamic, things change according to you know, the atmosphere in the cities you live in, globalization and all these things. And the only way to preserve it is through education and through use of this. And you know what Lesego was saying, when Don Matera speaks, you understand what he says, but you don't reply to him in that way. But with that, you know, who is going to speak the way he speaks anymore?
No. I just want to. Who's going to speak the way? The one problem I've got actually with a whole load of, should I say, language activists or people who see themselves as that, is people today in 2020, is it 2022? 22, yeah. Who today take offense when other people write in the voices of the land, of the day, because they see it as a prostitution of their very precious language, etc. They insist on people writing like they are living in 1822. I do not believe in that. I think that language takes upon it whatever it is, drags along with it. You know, things get stuck to it that were not there originally, and they grow with it, and it keeps growing like that. That when somebody insists that I write, strangely enough, in the way in which the missionaries that established Morija Press decided this is the language in its pure form, I find that to be very problematic and reactionary, in fact. I hope that...
Yeah. No, I completely understand. But then, you know, again, it's like, how do we preserve that? Because communities have attached meaning to that also, you know, in their own right. You know, we can't bar them from attaching meaning to it. So we have to come to a common understanding of preserving, or, you know, keeping up with the times of forming your own dialects, but also preserving what is there.
No, I'm not saying that certain aspects of language should be cast away. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying the insistence on some fake, romanticized notions of purity are problematic. Sure. That's all.
I fully understand your point.
Okay. So we do have to get going, but I wanted to just check if there's any comments. I know that a lot of questions happened earlier with regards to the Koples booker themselves, but if there's any questions regarding the artwork, I think we don't want to get stuck in language the whole time. We are here to celebrate the closing of Kamyar's exhibition. And this, thank you. Beautiful work, Kamyar. Thank you. It's so beautiful to see this work, and I hope it comes to Cape Town as well. But if there are any last questions, otherwise we can all head down if there's any pressing matters. So we will be around for the next hour and a half while I play, and Lady Day serves some amazing food, so we can also engage in that time as well. Yeah? Cool. Thank you so much for coming.